Recently, I did a short video outlining some very brief highlights from the history of knitting and a couple other fiber arts. And for a small subset of viewers, it was very important that they tell me how wrong I was, because how could knitting be associated with women today when knitting was exclusively done by men in knitting guilds back in medieval times? Clearly I was wrong, and I should feel wrong and feel bad, and all my other arguments were moot and could just be dismissed. So let's explore that, shall we? First of all, the statement that only men were allowed to knit several hundred years ago in countries like Italy, France, England, and Germany, where we have some records to look at, because knitting guilds at the time only allowed men to join, is just flat out wrong. Or rather, it is a faulty assumption based on just a few pieces of the whole puzzle where one does not necessarily lead to the other. Were there knitting guilds in several countries in medieval Europe? Absolutely. Did they only allow men to join, a common practice for many, though not all, craftsmen's guilds at the time? Yes, but with an asterisk. We have records of women joining guilds too, usually the wives, daughters, sisters, or other female family members of existing male guild members. They did, however, not command the same respect, support, or independence as male guild members, and were limited in how long they could run their husband's business after his death, for instance. Do these two statements together lead to the conclusion that it was only men who either could or were allowed to knit at the time? No, it does not. Fasten your seatbelts, folk, because we are about to take a trip down the systemic oppression of women lane. Before we get into it for real though, just a little heads up that this video will be using some pretty gendered language in talking about this subject, just due to the nature of the topic, especially as it pertains to gender roles in parts of Europe and the US. There are always going to be examples of people subverting those expectations or acting outside of their gender roles, of course, but just a heads up. It's going to be one of those. One tenet of feminist theory is the basic idea that if women were paid fair wages, or at least valued as such, for all the housework, child-rearing, emotional support, cooking, cleaning, caregiving of sick relatives, and other impressively taxing work that is still predominantly done by women and women-presenting folks, our world and how we view economy today would look very different. Following that line of thinking, when we look at European history through that lens of housework and other unpaid labor as economically important work, a trend starts to emerge, and that is that work for the home was and still is largely performed by women. But as soon as the work became something that could be sold for money or required exceptional skill and precision, it suddenly becomes the domain of men. We still have this subconscious bias permeating large areas of life today. The vocation primary school teacher, for instance, is often associated with women, while the word professor often brings to mind an older white man. The default person responsible for cooking at home are often women, but a professional chef, especially in high-end prestigious restaurants, are more often men. The word nurse usually brings to mind a woman, while doctor has many people think of a man. So the message we often end up receiving subconsciously is that if the work is paid or paid well, a man should do it. But if it is unpaid or paid less, women are expected to do it or are associated with the job. And the higher rates of women graduating college compared to men these days does not seem to have had a significant impact on this trend, at least not so far. And for Black, Indigenous, Asian, queer, immigrant, and other members of society who clearly deviates from the image we have of straight-passing, professional-looking white people, the numbers look even worse. Or said differently, many women do a lot of unpaid work or low-paid labor that many men would not even consider doing unless they got paid for it and paid properly. And many of these gender divides that we associate today with different jobs, social status, or family roles were somewhat less rigid in the past than a lot of us are led to believe. Before late 1800s and early 1900s, Victorian and Edwardian England brought with them not just incredibly rigid gender roles, but they also applied that heavily gendered lens to our past, giving us a very skewed and subjective lens that still affects how we look at history beyond this point today. Examples of this rewriting of history include medieval embroidery guilds, where we have records of women and men working together in guild workshops, but by the 1700s and 1800s, embroidery was associated primarily with women and was especially talked about as a suitable pastime by women of the higher classes. So simply because these were the values that were being forwarded, this coexisting of men and women in embroidery guilds was simply erased or underplayed from history as they taught and talked about it. We also see this in countries colonized or otherwise incredibly affected by the British and European way of thinking at the time, such as in India, where professional embroidery has long been an industry dominated by men, even if many Indians today also associate embroidery with quote-unquote women's work. At the other hand, folk embroidery in India is usually associated with women, so again, that follows our previously stated trend. And it is not as if we don't have examples of men, women, and gender non-conforming badasses who don't do what is expected of them or go beyond their gender expectations. We know that men can be amazing knitters, women can be incredible carpenters, and some people, like Wiwa, a two-spirit member of the Zuni Pueblo nation and who changed gender expression and pronouns multiple times throughout their life, and also was a highly accomplished weaver, incidentally, a craft people of the Zuni nation traditionally associated with men. We also see crafts associated with women crop up with sailors and soldiers, where sailors may engage in macrame and embroidery to pass the time on board, and soldiers from World War I were known to carry small sewing kits to enable them to repair their uniforms and do other basic mending tasks. Another thing that crops up when you look into history is that women made things for the home, while men made or sold things for commerce, which again leads us to underestimate the value of women's work, since it wasn't being paid a lot of the time in a world where income and money is seen as the big capitalist benchmark of success. This also came with an extra sparkle of discrimination, as we have multiple examples of laws being enacted or vocations becoming slurs. If enough women were able to find corners of the economy that made it possible for them to make a living without having to rely on marriage or a male relative. One such example is spinster, or a woman prior to the Industrial Revolution who made a living spinning thread. At least from the 14th century and continuously for at least 500 years after that, this was a job that could provide enough of an income that a woman could, if so inclined, live independently. And much like Crazy cat lady has been a derogatory term for unmarried women in our time, the title of spinster also came to mean something negative in our male-dominated history, though many are reclaiming the title of crazy cat lady proudly, and I am so here for it. Not to mention that recent Vogue article making the rounds asking, is having a boyfriend embarrassing now? What a time to be alive. Another example is that of alewives on the British Isles. Back when water was considered unsafe to drink, a slightly alcoholic drink that just so happened to kill off most of the pathogens in the water supply that could have made people sick was just the thing. Alewives, like spinsters, was a vocation that a lot of women did intermittently in between all their other housework and responsibilities, both as wives and widows, but also as single women supporting themselves, or to supplement a household's income. Even if neither spinster nor alewife were particularly lucrative businesses, it was better than no income at all, and for some, that precious freedom of not being dependent on a man made it more than worth it. But where there are business opportunities and independent opportunities, there may be legislation enacted to curb such creativity. One such example was a new law in Oxford from 1311 that required the husband to take responsibility if ale brewed by their wife caused a scholar any harm. Naturally, this made a lot of husbands much less inclined to encourage or support their wives' side hustle. This, along with the rise of professional breweries that took a higher and higher share of the ale industry, led many women to be pushed out of the brewing industry, especially after the Black Death of 1348, where the few who survived the plague had much less money to spend. Yet another nail in the coffin for alewives came in 1355, when Oxford University was granted the sole jurisdiction to the brewing trade of Oxford. After all, what is more terrifying than a woman who makes her own living and doesn't need no man? And now that we have looked at a couple of examples where women have been systematically either shamed for independence or outright legislated out of income-generating ventures, let us come back to the textile arts in general and knitting in particular that this video is focused on. As with our other examples, there seems to have been a divide between women doing things for the household and men engaging in commercial ventures, even within aspects of the same craft or trade, though often women were seen working alongside their husbands or other male relatives and had to juggle both the needs of the household and their contribution to the family's commercial venture. This is something we still see today and is still an issue, where women are increasingly expected to take on paid work and employment to support the household in the name of equality, but are still often solely responsible for the running of the household as well, without men taking on a significant share of the household work in return for both or more the partners in a relationship who are working outside the home. These were expectations put on women throughout history too. We have seen Assyrian merchants who would, for instance, frequently write home to their female relatives to ask them to weave a particular type of cloth or how their clothwork in general was coming along. On one such occasion, we have an extant example of a wife writing back to her husband, explaining that they hadn't been able to make the cloth he requested in time because other cloth needs within the household had been pressing as well, such as clothing the members of the household and children, as well as all textiles, curtains, or linens required for their home. Entirely unimportant and frivolous womanly activities with no societal value at all. We cannot mistake women often being confined to making things for the home to mean that they did not significantly contribute to the economy of their household, though. Just like with cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and home management today, imagine what would happen if each household had to source and pay for those services externally. And just like examples from history show us, expecting and conditioning women to do that unpaid work necessary to keep a household and society running often results in the wives and women being financially dependent on their spouse or partner in our capitalist and money-dependent society. So valuable has the unpaid or less paid work of women been considered throughout history that we have examples of female slaves being preferred for the skills they brought with them. In ancient Sumer, as the society slowly became more militarized and male-dominated, slavery would increasingly become a real risk, especially to women, with male slaves being in far smaller numbers than female ones, and the selling of wives and children being a common practice for men to pay off their debts. Similar preferences towards the skilled work of women within textile arts were also seen during the slave trades of the Americas, where women were essential to not just the cotton picking industry, but also the indigo, weaving, and other textile art trades. One particularly interesting example is an inscribed flying shuttle used by an enslaved woman called Eveline in the 1800s. The inscription tells us that Eveline wove cloth to clothe an outstanding 75 other enslaved humans at her plantation. And we cannot gloss over the unsavory truth that women were also very valuable as slaves because they could be forced to bring forth new generations of humans who were, of course, also enslaved by their enslavers. The division of women being responsible for the household as well as family business venture was seen within knitting too. At the influx of knitting to Europe, women were providing the knitting needs of their household and a smaller amount for sale, if they could find the time to make any extra. But as knitted stockings, caps, and other knitted items rose in popularity among the wealthier classes, women were simply not able to provide enough knitted goods to satisfy this demand on top of all their other household responsibilities. And so we see the rise of the aforementioned male-dominated knitting guilds, where the guilds took care of the more affluent middle class and royal customers and thus had a monopoly on the more affluent customers. Women, on the other hand, were stuck providing what small knitting surplus they could produce beyond the needs of their household to the less affluent, poor, and working classes, keeping them from higher income work and customers who were able to pay for much better items, and continued to keep women largely dependent on their male relatives, making sure wage gaps stay gaps, if not outright canyons. But again, it was not as if women weren't helping their male relatives with their businesses as well. We have plenty of sources documenting women in workshops as stonemasons, carpenters, and pretty much involved in almost all the various craftsmen's guilds in some way or another, often helping their husband or father with the work, or even in some instances running the business until a son became of age. There are also historical records of female textile guilds, two of which from the 15th and 16th century in Rouen, France. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of assistance flowing in the other direction though, so men helping out with the housework, rendering a very askew image of labor, much like what we see today. And on at least one occasion, men have taken over crafts previously run by women, such as in the case of silkwomen in medieval London who hadn't formed a guild to protect their interests, and whose craft got taken over by men who did form a guild and excluded them, which is just yet another example of conscious and targeted exclusion of women from income-generating work, especially when that work was done independent of men. So In short, it is simply not true that women didn't knit back during the medieval era in places like England and France, just because there also existed discriminatory craftsman skills that were primarily the arena of men at the same time. Women have contributed to household work and income back as far as we can trace it, even though we did and still do suffer prejudices, discrimination, and outright wage theft. Textile arts of all kinds, and not just knitting, have been popular crafts for women for several hundred years, especially pre-industrial revolution, where many simply couldn't allow themselves to let their hands be idle for too long in between other work. One theory as to why textile work has often been especially linked to women's work in various parts of the world is that skilled textile workers are able to pick up and put down again their work at short notice, something that is compatible with minding small children. We have pictures and evidence as varied as Scottish women working as herring gutters, who would be working on knits for their family whenever they were waiting for more herring to arrive at the ports. And we have multiple examples showing Madonna knitting in Christian imagery from the 1300s and 1400s. And I hope this doesn't need saying, but I will anyway. This same line of thinking also applies to male-dominated weaving guilds. Women still absolutely wove cloth, they were just excluded from a lot of the higher paid and more prestigious work. Being systemically excluded in various places and trade does not mean there weren't people skilled at or practicing said crafts in some aspects as well, or perhaps in spite of being excluded and gatekept from said places and also the advanced techniques, if guilds could find those. And as a lover and mother of avoids, I can only say that I wholeheartedly support the growing number of women today, taking the mantle of crazy cat lady as a badge of honor, especially since the alternative often includes several more hours of housework per week for women in straight relationships, relative to both single women and single mothers. Know that your independence today is honoring a long tradition of women carving out what freedom they can from financial dependency, and that this has been a continuous effort for hundreds and thousands of years. Thank you for watching this little deep dive on this multifaceted and fascinating, but also highly frustrating subject. We certainly still have a long way to go. Angela, a friend of mine and co-founder of the amazing WPF, Women Personal Finance, a group that focuses on financial education and support of women and women-identifying folks, do a lot of awareness posts on just how prevalent partner financial dependency and financial abuse still is today. And it is still one of the biggest reasons women are struggling to or unable to leave relationships. I'll leave some links below if you want to check out what taking charge of your finances from a leftist and community-based point of view could look like, because Angela and Regina do some really amazing work. Certainly recommend. I can also recommend the work of Emma Holten, a Danish feminist and author of Deficit: How Feminist Economics Can Change Our World, suggested to me by our fantastic community. All that and more in the description below, where you will, as usual, also find the references that have been used throughout this video. Although I think the reference list may have exceeded the YouTube character limit with this one, but I'll pop it on my website in full and leave you a link to that below so you can peruse it at your leisure. Thank you also to our amazing and increasingly growing number of patrons who help make videos like this and other topics possible. There has been a larger than usual influx this last month, and I can only say thank you. It is deeply humbling to me to see people relating and supporting the work that I do. And I can only hope that I'll be able to live up to some of the trust you are putting in the channel, the community, and the work that we do. Really, thank you. Bye.